The director of a royal museum flew across an ocean, stood in the weeds beside my rented house, looked at the pile of rusted scrap 3 men had sold me as a joke, and offered me $30 million for it on the spot. She thought she was rescuing a poor fool from his own mistake. Her whole career had trained her to expect a greedy man who would hear that number and beg for more. 3 grease-covered junkyard men had sold me that wreck for $40 2 weeks earlier, laughing so hard one of them fell down, certain they had found the dumbest man in the county. What none of them knew, not the laughing men, not the elegant woman from the palace, was that I was the only person alive on that entire continent who could see what that rusted heap really was. Because of a poor old immigrant on a stool in a garage 30 years ago who I thought was only telling me bedtime stories. And what I told that museum director in the 60 seconds after she offered me $30 million was the one thing she never, in 30 years, saw coming. But before I tell you what I said, do me one quick favor. If you have ever been the person that important people laugh at because they think you're too poor or too simple to know any better, hit that subscribe button right now. This whole channel is built for the people the world is sure it can fool. Go on. I'll wait. Now, let me back all the way up, because to understand why a royal museum wired a junk hauler $30 million, you first have to understand a cruel joke, $40 I couldn't spare, and a grandfather I didn't know was handing me a fortune. My name is Caleb Walsh. I am 38 years old and I work with my hands. I do a little of everything. I fix fences, I haul scrap, I do odd jobs for people who need a strong back and don't ask too many questions. I have never had much money. I have never expected to. I grew up poor in a small town, and I learned early that the world is divided into people who get laughed at and people who do the laughing, and I knew which side I was on before I was old enough to spell it. But I will tell you something that took me a long time to understand. The people who get laughed at, the quiet ones, the ones the world thinks are simple, they often know things the loud people never bother to learn, because when you have nothing, you pay attention. You learn the worth of things, real things, because you have to. You learn to look at what's in front of you instead of at the price tag somebody stuck on it. Most people never learn to do that. They spend their whole lives looking at price tags. They never once look at the thing itself. That right there is most of the story. Everything else is just details. I am raising my son. His name is Eli, and he is 10 years old, and it has been just the 2 of us for 6 years now. His mother left when he was 4. I am not going to spend time on why, because it is an old wound and a boring story, and it is not the point. The point is that one ordinary morning I became a single father, completely and forever, without being even a little bit ready for it. Nobody is ever ready. I was less ready than most. But you do it anyway because the alternative is unthinkable, and somewhere in the doing of it, the not being ready quietly becomes the most important thing you'll ever be. So it's me and Eli. He's a quiet kid, watchful, the kind who notices everything and says little. He likes to take things apart to see how they work. He keeps a little notebook where he draws machines, engines, gears, things with moving parts. I don't always understand what he's drawing, but I never tell him that. I just tell him it's good, because it is, and because a kid who loves something deserves to be told it matters. He is, without any competition, the best thing I have ever done with my life. Now, I need to tell you about my grandfather, because my grandfather is the reason I knew what I was looking at when everybody else just saw rust. My grandfather was an immigrant. He came from the old world, from a country far away, after a war that took almost everything from him. Before all that, before he lost it all and crossed an ocean to start over with nothing, he had been something I never fully understood as a boy. He had worked, as a young man, in the workshops of the very rich, not as one of them. As a craftsman, he built and repaired the grand carriages and the early motor cars of nobility, of royalty. He had a gift for it, a deep old knowledge passed down in his family, and the great families of the old world had once trusted his hands with their most precious machines. He lost all of it in the war. He came here, and became a poor man who fixed lawnmowers and bicycles for pocket change, and the world saw a poor old immigrant who could barely speak the language. But on his days off, he would sit me down, a little boy, on a stool in his garage, and he would tell me about the machines of the old world, the grand ones, the ones built for kings. He would describe them to me in such detail that I could see them, the hand-shaped metal, the maker's marks, the way you could tell a true royal commission from an ordinary luxury car by 100 tiny secrets that only the craftsman knew. I thought they were just stories, bedtime stories for a poor kid with nothing else. I did not know my grandfather was handing me a fortune. I did not know he was teaching me to see something that, decades later, would be sitting in a junkyard, covered in rust, with 3 men laughing at me for wanting it. He died when I was 16. I thought his stories died with him. I was wrong. So now let me tell you about the day of the joke. I had picked up some work at a scrapyard on the edge of town, a big, ugly place full of dead cars and twisted metal, run by a man named Bert and his 2 grown sons. They were not kind men. They were the kind who laughed loud and looked for someone smaller to laugh at, and they had decided a long time ago that I was that someone. I needed the work, so I took their jokes the way you take bad weather. You don't take it personally, you just keep your head down and do the job. That day, the 3 of them were standing around a heap of metal that had just come in, way at the back of the lot, near the crusher. It barely looked like a car anymore. It was a wreck, a rusted-out shell, no engine that you could see, no glass, no seats, just a corroded body sitting on flat, rotted tires, brown and orange with rust, half sunk into the mud. It had been sitting somewhere wet and forgotten for what looked like 50 years. It was, by every appearance, garbage, the kind of thing you pay to have hauled away. But something stopped me when I walked past it. It was the shape. Under the rust, under the rot, under 50 years of neglect, the shape was wrong for a junk car. The proportions were wrong, the line of the body, the curve of what was left of the long hood, the way the frame sat. My grandfather's voice came up out of somewhere deep, the voice from the stool in the garage describing the great machines of the old world. And I stopped walking, and I stared at that wreck, and the hair on my arms stood up. I crouched down in the mud, ignoring the 3 men, and I looked closer, and I started to see them. The secrets my grandfather had described, the hand-shaped metal, even under the rust, that no factory machine ever made, a particular kind of rivet, the remains of a coach builder's line where 2 panels met, the kind of work that takes a master a year to do by hand. And then, near where a door had once been, half eaten by rust, but still there, a small shape pressed into the metal, a maker's mark. I could not read it through the corrosion, but I knew, the way you know a face in the dark, that it was the kind of mark my grandfather had spent my whole childhood describing, a craftsman's mark from the old world, the kind that went on machines built for the very greatest families, the kind that did not belong, could not possibly belong, in a junkyard at the edge of a poor town on the other side of the world. I stood up slowly. My heart was going hard. And that's when Bert noticed me looking. "You like that, Walsh?" he said, and his sons started grinning, because they could smell a joke coming. "You got an eye for fine automobiles, do you?" "What is it?" I asked. I tried to keep my voice flat. "Where'd it come from?" Bert laughed. "Came in with an estate lot. Some old hoarder died. We cleared his property. This was rotting in the back of a barn under a tarp. It's scrap, Walsh. Pure scrap, going in the crusher tomorrow." He looked at his sons, and his grin got wider and meaner. "Why? You want it?" And here is where the cruelty came in, because Bert saw something in my face, and he decided to have fun with it. "Tell you what," he said, "since you're so taken with it, I'll sell it to you. This fine luxury automobile, this collector's item." His sons were already laughing. $40, cash, right now. And you haul it off my lot yourself, because I'm not lifting a finger to help you move your treasure. $40. They were laughing because $40 was a cruel price. It was nothing for a real car and a fortune to pay for a pile of rust. They were laughing because they thought I was simple. They thought the poor man who'd believe a rusted wreck was worth buying was the funniest thing they'd seen all week. They wanted me to say yes, so they could tell the story for years. Did you hear about Walsh? Paid $40 for a heap of scrap? What an idiot. I had $43 in my pocket. It was most of what I had until my next pay. It was Eli's grocery money for half a week. And I thought about my grandfather, and I thought about that maker's mark. And I thought, if I am wrong, I have thrown away half a week's food on a joke, and these men will laugh at me for years, and if I am right. I took the $40 out of my pocket. My hand was not quite steady, and I put it in Bert's hand. Done? I said. Well, the three of them about fell over laughing. They laughed so hard one of the sons had to sit down. Bert pocketed my $40 and wiped his eyes and said, "Pleasure doing business with you, you absolute moron. Now get it off my lot by tomorrow, or I crush it with you watching." I borrowed a flatbed trailer from a friend who owed me a favor and didn't ask questions. It took me 4 hours and most of my strength to drag and winch that rotted wreck out of the mud and onto the trailer, while the three of them watched and made comments and took pictures on their phones to send to their friends. I did not say a word. I just did the work, the way I always do. Let them laugh. Laughing is free, and you can't stop a man from doing it. I had what I came for. I towed it home and unloaded it in the empty lot beside the little house we rented, and that night, after Eli was asleep, I went out with a flashlight and a wire brush and a bucket of water, and I started, very gently, to clean a small patch of metal around that maker's mark. It took me 2 hours, working slow, terrified of damaging it, and when I finally got the corrosion cleared away enough to see it under the flashlight, I had to sit down right there in the dirt, because I knew that mark. My grandfather had drawn it for me, in the dust on his workbench, more times than I could count. It was the mark of a coach-building house from the old world, the very greatest of them, a workshop that had built machines for one family and one family only for over 100 years, a royal family. My grandfather had worked in that very house as a young man, before the war took everything. He had told me its mark was almost never seen, because almost every machine it ever made had been destroyed in the war, or lost, or locked away in royal collections where the public never set eyes on them. And one of them, a lost one, a wreck the whole world had forgotten, was sitting in the weeds beside my rented house, bought for $40 as a joke. I did not sleep that night. I sat beside it in the dark, this old broken, impossible thing. And I felt my grandfather sitting beside me, and for the first time in 20 years I understood that the stories he told me on that stool had not been to pass the time. He had been giving me the only inheritance he had left. He had been teaching a poor boy to see treasure that rich men would walk right past. The next morning I did something that scared me more than handing over the $40. I started trying to find out the truth. I am not an educated man, not in the school way. But Eli is smart with computers, and together, over several evenings, we did the careful work of finding out what I had. I photographed the mark, and the hand-shaped metal, and the coach builder's lines. Eli helped me search, helped me write careful emails, helped me find the names of people who study old machines for a living. I was terrified the whole time that I was wrong, that I was the fool Bert thought I was, that any second now an expert would write back and laugh at the poor man who thought his rusted heap was treasure. That is not what happened. The first expert I reached, a man at a university who studied historic automobiles, wrote back within an hour of seeing my photos, and his email had so many exclamation points that I thought something was wrong with my screen. He asked me, please, not to touch it further, not to clean it, not to move it, and to tell no one until he could make some calls. He said the words, "If this is real," 4 times. He said it could not be real. He said there was no possible way it was real. And then he said, "But it looks real." Within a week, my rusted $40 wreck had become the quiet center of a storm I did not understand and could barely keep up with. Experts wanted to see it. Then more experts. Then a woman wrote to me whose email signature took up half the screen with titles and whose name was attached to a museum I had only ever heard of the way you hear about the moon. A royal museum in the old country, my grandfather's old country. Her name was Dr. Sophia Brandt. And she did not write like the others, all exclamation points and disbelief. She wrote carefully, formally, like a woman who had learned long ago not to let herself hope for things because hoping for things had cost her before. She said her institution had been searching for this exact machine for over 40 years. She said it was one of 3 that had vanished in the chaos of the war, presumed destroyed. She said its loss was considered one of the great tragedies of her field. And she said, at the end of a very long and very careful message, that she would like to come and see it herself, in person, as soon as I would permit it. She flew across an ocean to stand in the weeds beside my rented house. I want to tell you about the moment Dr. Sophia Brandt first saw it, because it told me everything about who she was. She arrived in a car that cost more than every house on my street put together, in a coat that probably cost more than I make in a year, with an assistant and a translator she turned out not to need, because her English was better than mine. She was maybe 50, silver-haired, elegant, with the straight back and still face of a woman who had spent her whole life being the most serious person in every room. I braced myself. I had spent 2 weeks getting laughed at by Bert and his sons, and I fully expected this grand woman from a royal museum to take one look at my rusted heap and my rented house and my dirty work boots and decide the whole thing was a poor man's foolish mistake. She got out of the car, she looked at the wreck sitting in the weeds, and she walked toward it slowly, and she stopped a few feet away, and she put one gloved hand over her mouth. And then this composed, formal, serious woman, the director of a royal museum, stood in the weeds beside a poor man's rented house and began, silently, to cry. She did not perform it. She tried to stop it. She was embarrassed by it, but she stood there with her hand over her mouth and tears running down her face, looking at a rusted ruin that to me had seemed like garbage 2 weeks before, and I understood that she was seeing something I could not yet see. She was seeing a ghost. She was seeing a thing her whole field had mourned, as lost forever, sitting impossibly in the sunlight, real. "Forgive me," she said finally, wiping her face, angry at herself. "I have studied this machine my entire career. I wrote my dissertation on the 3 that were lost. I have looked at photographs of it taken in 1938 1,000 times. I never once believed I would stand in front of it. I never believed it survived." She looked at me, and her eyes were red, and her voice was unsteady. "Where did it come from? How is it here? How is it possible that it is here, in the weeds, beside your house?" So I told her. I told her about the junkyard and the $40 and Bert and his sons laughing. And as I talked, her face went from wonder to something else, something harder and colder. And when I got to the part about the cruel joke and the $40, she closed her eyes for a moment, like she was in pain. "They laughed at you," she said quietly. "They sold the lost crown of my entire field to a kind man as a joke for $40 to humiliate him." She shook her head slowly. "And he was the only person in that entire country who could see what it was. Of course he was. Of course it was you." She looked at me with an expression I did not know what to do with. "Tell me, how did you know?" An educated man would not have known. The auction houses did not know. The scrapyard did not know. How did you know? And I told her about my grandfather, the stool in the garage, the stories I thought were just stories, the old immigrant who fixed lawnmowers and used to build machines for kings. And I told her the name of the coach-building house he had worked in as a young man before the war. Dr. Sophia Brandt went absolutely white. "Say that name again," she whispered. I said it again. She sat down. She just sat down, right there on an overturned bucket in my weedy lot, this elegant woman in her expensive coat, and she stared at me. The records of that workshop were almost entirely destroyed in the war, she said. But not all of them. We have fragments. We have a partial ledger of the craftsmen who worked there in the years before everything was lost. I have read that ledger so many times I could recite it. She looked up at me. Your grandfather? What was his name? I told her his name. And Dr. Sophia Brandt put her hand over her mouth again, and this time when the tears came, she did not try to stop them. He is in the ledger, she said. Your grandfather is in the ledger. I have read his name 100 times and wondered what became of him, because so many of them simply vanished in the war. We assumed he died, like most of them. She laughed, a broken, amazed little laugh. He did not die. He crossed an ocean and became poor and fixed lawnmowers and told his grandson the old stories on a stool in a garage. And because he did, because one craftsman refused to let the knowledge die even when everything else was taken from him, the lost machine he once helped build was recognized 50 years later by the only pair of eyes in the world that could have known it. She shook her head. Do you understand what your grandfather did? He saved this twice, once with his hands as a young man, and once with his stories by teaching you to see. I had to turn away from her for a minute. I am not ashamed to say it. The work of authenticating it took weeks. Experts came from 3 countries. They confirmed everything, slowly, carefully, then completely. It was real. It was one of the 3 lost machines. It was, they told me, the single most significant historic automobile to surface anywhere in the world in over 30 years. And because of who had built it and who it had been built for, it belonged, in the deepest sense, to the heritage of a nation and a royal house on the other side of the world. And then came the moment I told you about at the very beginning. Dr. Sophia Brandt, standing in my weedy lot with the authentication complete, telling me that her museum, with the backing of the royal family itself, wished to acquire it, and that the value they were prepared to wire to me, a man who 2 weeks earlier had counted out $40 with a shaking hand, was $30 million. $30 million. For the wreck Bert sold me as a joke. Now, here is the part I most need you to hear, because this is where the story stops being about money, and it is the thing she never saw coming. When Dr. Brandt named the $30 million, I was quiet for a long moment, and then I told her something I had been thinking about for days. I told her I did not want to sell it for $30 million. There was a long silence. I think she was afraid I was about to ask for more. People had probably trained her to expect that. I don't want a sale, I said. I want to give it back. Now it was her turn to be unable to speak. Let me explain, I said. My grandfather helped build that machine, and then the war took everything from him and his country, and the machine was lost, and he spent the rest of his life poor and far from home, telling stories nobody believed. That machine doesn't belong to me. It never did. It belongs to his country, to the people he came from, to the place those craftsmen built it for. I took a breath. If I sell it to you for $30 million, then for the rest of his afterlife and the rest of my life, this is a story about a poor man who got rich off a wreck. And I don't want that to be the story. I want the story to be that the machine went home, that my grandfather's work went home. That's worth more to me than the money. It has to go home, and it can't go home with a price tag on it, or it's not really going home. Dr. Sophia Brandt was quiet for so long, I thought she had stopped breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the careful, formal voice anymore. It was bare. In 30 years in this field, she said, I have watched people fight over fortunes far smaller than this. I have watched families destroy each other over a single painting. I have never, not once, had anyone offer to give something back. She paused. You understand that you are a poor man. You understand what $30 million would mean for you, for your son. I understand exactly what it would mean, I said. That's why I have to be careful with it. A man raising a boy alone has to be able to look that boy in the eye and explain every choice he ever made. I want my son to grow up knowing his great-grandfather's work went home because it was the right thing, not because we couldn't resist a check. Some things are worth more than money. I learned that from a poor old man on a stool in a garage, and I'm not going to forget it now, just because the number got big. Now, the true ending is better than $30 million, so let me give it to you. Dr. Sophia Brandt would not let me give it away for nothing. She said her conscience would not survive it, and neither would the honor of the royal house she served. A great wrong had been done to my grandfather's generation, she said, and a great gift was being offered now. And both of those things had to be answered properly, or the whole thing was hollow. So we found a third way, the way that wasn't a sale and wasn't a gift, but something better than both. The machine went home. It traveled across the ocean to the museum to be restored over years by master craftsmen and displayed as a recovered national treasure with a plaque beside it. And the plaque does not just name the royal family it was built for, it names the workshop, and it names the craftsmen of that workshop who were lost in the war. And at the top of that list of names, the man credited with the machine's survival and rediscovery is my grandfather. His name, in a royal museum, on the other side of the world, forever. The poor immigrant who fixed lawnmowers has his name on the wall of a palace because he refused to let the old knowledge die. I will never get over that as long as I live. And the royal family, who would not accept a treasure for nothing, established a fund, not a payment to me, a foundation in my grandfather's name that teaches the dying old crafts, the coach building and the metalwork, and the deep hand knowledge that the war had nearly erased, to young people who could never otherwise afford to learn them. The first student enrolled, with his education guaranteed for life so it could never be taken away, was a quiet, watchful, 10-year-old boy who likes to take things apart to see how they work and draws machines in a little notebook. My son, Eli, learning the craft his great-great-grandfather carried out of a burning country with nothing but his hands and his memory. I did take something for myself in the end, Dr. Brandt insisted, and I let her win one because a man can only be so stubborn before it becomes a kind of pride of its own. Enough to buy us a small house, a real one, ours, that nobody can take away. Enough that Eli will never go hungry again and never lie awake hearing his father worry about grocery money. Not $30 million. I would not take that, but enough to be safe. The rest went home, where it belonged, with my grandfather's name on it. Bert and his sons heard about it, of course. The whole town heard about it. The man who sold the royal treasure for $40 as a joke became, very briefly, the most famous fool in the county. People ask me if I went back to gloat, if I drove out to that junkyard and laughed in his face the way he laughed in mine. I didn't. I thought about it. I won't pretend I didn't. But here is the thing I figured out, standing in my new kitchen, watching my son draw machines at a table that was finally ours. Bert looked at that wreck and saw $40 and a chance to laugh at a poor man. I looked at the same wreck and saw my grandfather's hands and a treasure the world had mourned. We were both looking at the exact same pile of rusted metal. The only difference between us was what we had been taught to see, and you cannot punish a man for being blind. You can only feel a little sorry for him and be grateful that somebody, once, on a stool in a garage, took the time to teach you how to look. So that's the whole of it. A cruel joke, $40 I couldn't spare, and a grandfather's stories I thought were worthless. It turned out the stories were the inheritance all along. The wreck was just the proof. So let me ask you one thing before you go, and then I'll let you get back to your evening. 3 men looked at that machine and saw garbage because they only ever learned to read price tags. One poor man looked at it and saw a treasure, because somebody who loved him taught him to look at the thing itself. The treasure was there the whole time. It was sitting in the mud where anyone could have seen it. The difference was never the machine. The difference was the eyes. So here's what I honestly want to know from you tonight. Who taught you how to see? Who sat you down somewhere along the way and gave you a way of looking at the world that turned out to be worth more than money, even if you didn't understand it at the time? An old grandfather, a teacher, a stranger, anyone. Have you ever thanked them? Do they even know what they gave you? Tell me about them down in the comments. I read every single one, and these stories are the whole reason I do this. And if this one reached you tonight, if you believe like I've come to believe that the most valuable thing one person can hand another is simply a better way of seeing, then do me one small favor before you go. Subscribe, if you haven't yet, so you don't miss the next one. Tap that like button so somebody else gets a chance to find this. And tell me about the person who taught you to look. I'll be right here. I read every word.